In 1950, San Jose was the 36th largest city in California, smaller than Fresno, smaller than Long Beach. A quiet agricultural market town of 95,000 people sitting in a valley so fertile and so forgotten that most Americans couldn't have placed it on a map. It had no deep water port. It had no oil fields. It had no coal deposits, no iron, no natural harbor, no famous skyline. What it had was apricot trees. Hundreds of thousands of apricot trees and cherry trees and prune trees, row after row after row of them blanketing the valley floor from the bay to the foothills in a bloom so thick and so sweet that the whole place had been given a name that sounded like a fairy tale. The Valley of Heart's Delight. 50 years later, that same city was the 10th largest in the United States. The third richest city on the planet, measured by GDP per capita behind only Zurich and Oslo. The undisputed capital of the most consequential industrial revolution in human history. A metro area whose publicly traded companies were collectively worth more than the entire economies of most nations. A place where the median house, not a mansion, just a regular house in a regular neighborhood, sold for over $2 million. A place that generated more venture capital, more patents, more billionaires per square mile than anywhere else on Earth. No agricultural town in modern history has ever made that leap. Not even close. And no city has ever been quite so strange about the way it happened, because San Jose did not rise the way great cities usually rise. It did not rise because a river ran through it. It did not rise because it sat on a natural trade route or because an empire decided to build there. San Jose rose because of what happened in a garage, and in a laboratory, and in a chip fabrication plant, and in the minds of a particular kind of person who kept washing up in this valley decade after decade, drawn by something that wasn't quite visible yet, some future that hadn't been named. But before any of that, before the garage and the laboratory and the chip plant, before the word silicon was ever attached to any valley, there was something far older and far stranger. There was the beginning. The people who first called this valley home had a name for themselves that history nearly erased. The Ohlone. They had lived in the Santa Clara Valley for roughly 4,000 years, building villages along the Guadalupe River, fishing the tidal marshes of the bay, gathering acorns in the oak woodlands that covered the foothills. They had a complex social structure, an intricate system of trade with tribes as far north as what is now Washington State, and a relationship with this land so embedded it was almost geological. They knew every creek, every game trail, every seasonal flooding pattern. They had watched this valley through droughts and floods and fires, and they had survived all of it. They would not survive the Europeans. In November of 1777, a Spanish military officer named José Joaquín Moraga led a column of settlers into the valley under orders from the Viceroy of New Spain and founded El Pueblo de San José de Guadalupe. It was the first civilian town in California that was not directly attached to a mission or a military fort. The settlers were farmers first and colonists second. The Pueblo's reason for existence was the soil. The first census, taken 2 months later, recorded 68 people. The Ohlone, who had lived here for 4 millennia, were not counted. Within a generation, forced into the missions, exposed to diseases for which they had no immunity, their population would collapse. The valley that had sustained them for 4,000 years would be handed to strangers who had been walking for weeks and barely knew where they were. The Pueblo struggled. It flooded repeatedly. The Guadalupe River, which gave the settlement its water, also tore through it without warning, forcing the settlers to relocate at least once to higher ground. By 1822, when Mexico won independence from Spain and took California with it, San Jose was still a village of a few hundred people scratching food out of the earth. By 1845, the population had barely reached 900. For 68 years, this place had been a supply depot masquerading as a town. And then, In 1845, a Mexican cavalry captain named Andres Castillero rode into the hills south of town and changed everything. Or rather, some Olón Indians changed everything, without intending to and without receiving any credit for it. They had been using a bright red powder from the hillsides for centuries, as body paint, as pigment, as trade currency with tribes hundreds of miles away. When Castillero saw it, he recognized it immediately. Cinnabar, mercury ore. And he understood something the Olón had never needed to know: that mercury was the one substance without which the California gold rush, then still 3 years in the future, could not have happened. Gold does not easily separate from crushed rock, but mercury, poured over pulverized ore, bonds with the gold atoms and pulls them out of the stone. Without mercury, the miners of 1849 would have had almost nothing to show for their digging. And without San Jose's new Almaden mines, which began operations in 1846 and became the most productive mercury source in North America, the gold rush, as history knows, it would not exist. California's most famous event, the one that turned it from a territory into a state almost overnight, was built on the back of a substance mined in the hills south of San Jose by workers from Chile, Mexico, and Sonora who lived in company-owned housing and breathed mercury vapor until their nervous systems failed. The new Almaden mines produced more than 1 million flasks of mercury over their lifetime, more metallic wealth than any single gold mine in California. When California became a state in 1850 and San Jose became its first capital, hosting the very first and second sessions of the state legislature, the wealth that made statehood thinkable was flowing out of the hills directly above the Capitol building. The city that ran the state ran on poison. The capital didn't last long. 2 years, then it moved north to Vallejo, then Sacramento. San Jose returned to what it had always been, a regional market town with good soil and no particular reason to be famous. The railroad arrived in 1864, connecting it to San Francisco, and for a while, that was enough. Canneries opened. Fruit packing operations expanded. By the turn of the 20th century, the Santa Clara Valley was the largest fruit-producing region in the world. Over 100,000 acres of orchard blanketed the valley floor. Every spring, when the trees bloomed simultaneously, the entire basin turned white and pink, and the air smelled like something that had no name in any language that wasn't the language of this particular place. The farmers who worked those orchards were not wealthy. They were comfortable. They ran small operations of 10, 20, 50 acres, growing prunes and apricots and cherries, packing them in the canneries that lined the railroad tracks. They sent their children to San Jose State, the oldest public institution of higher education on the West Coast, founded in 1857, and the children mostly came back, because the valley was beautiful, and the life was good, and there was no particular reason to leave. This was not a place that attracted ambition. It was a place that rewarded staying. And then, 60 miles to the north, a group of men made a decision that would eventually erase everything those farmers had built. Stanford University had been founded in 1885 by railroad baron Leland Stanford on a vast farm in Palo Alto as a memorial to his dead son. For decades it was a pleasant regional school with a good engineering program and a massive land grant that no one quite knew what to do with. The land couldn't be sold. Leland Stanford's will prohibited it. But it could be leased, and in the late 1930s, a Stanford engineering professor named Frederick Terman began to see in that fact the outlines of something that had never existed before. Terman had watched talented graduates leave California for jobs in the East his whole career, feeding the engineering empires of Archaea, GE, and Bell Labs. It struck him as a hemorrhage. The university was producing brilliant people and then watching them disappear into other cities' economies. He began pushing back. He started encouraging his best students not to go east, to stay in California, to start companies in the valley instead of going to work for someone else's company somewhere else. The first 2 students who took him seriously were William Hewlett and David Packard. In 1938, they started building audio oscillators in a one-car garage at 367 Addison Avenue in Palo Alto. Their initial investment was $538. Their first major customer was Walt Disney Studios, which bought 8 of their oscillators for the sound system of Fantasia. By 1950, they were a public company. The garage at 367 Addison Avenue would eventually be designated a California Historical Landmark. A plaque on the building calls it the birthplace of Silicon Valley, which is both true and slightly misleading, because the real birthplace was not the garage. It was the mind of the man who told them to build in it. Terman understood something no one had fully articulated yet, that the university was not just a place that trained engineers. It could be an engine that turned engineering into a regional economy. In 1951, he pushed Stanford to create the Stanford Industrial Park, the first university-owned industrial park in the world, leasing portions of the university's otherwise unsaleable land to technology companies at favorable rates. Varian Associates moved in first. Then Hewlett-Packard. Then General Electric, Eastman Kodak, Lockheed. Terman called the park his secret weapon. He was not being modest, he was being precise. And in 1956, a single decision brought the whole thing into focus. William Shockley had won the Nobel Prize for co-inventing the transistor. He was arguably the most important living scientist in the field of electronics. He was also, by nearly every account, one of the most difficult human beings anyone had ever tried to work with. Paranoid, autocratic, prone to demanding lie detector tests from his employees on the faintest suspicion of disloyalty. When he decided to found Shockley's Semiconductor Laboratory in Mountain View, a few miles south of Palo Alto, he chose the location for the simplest possible reason. His mother lived in Palo Alto, and he wanted to be close to her. That accident of maternal geography would do more to shape the modern world than almost any deliberate decision anyone has ever made. Shockley attracted the finest young engineers in the country. Among them were Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore, and 6 others who collectively represented something close to the peak of what American engineering education had produced. They lasted 1 year under Shockley's management before they'd had enough. In 1957, all 8 of them resigned together, the first mass employee walkout in the history of Silicon Valley and arguably the most consequential act of insubordination in the history of American industry. Shockley called them the Traitorous 8. The name stuck. What he didn't understand, and couldn't have, was that the act of treason was also the act of creation. The 8 men needed money. A young investment banker named Arthur Rock flew out to California, met them, and made a decision that essentially invented modern venture capital. He agreed to back a team with no product, no revenue, and no track record, betting entirely on the quality of the people. Sherman Fairchild put up $1.5 million. Fairchild Semiconductor was born. In 1959, Robert Noyce developed the first commercially viable integrated circuit, a single chip that replaced what had previously required a room full of vacuum tubes. It was the most important invention of the 20th century, and it was made 12 miles south of San Jose in a low-slung building in Mountain View that would look unremarkable even today. What Fairchild did next was the thing that made Silicon Valley into Silicon Valley, and it had nothing to do with any particular invention. It spun. Engineers left. They took their knowledge and their habits and started new companies. Fairchild spawned more than 40 technology companies in the following decade, including National Semiconductor Advanced Micro Devices, and a company founded by Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore in 1968 that they called Integrated Electronics. Intel. Steve Jobs once described Fairchild Semiconductor as a ripe dandelion. You blow on it, he said, and the seeds of entrepreneurship spread on the wind. The wind that scattered those seeds blew straight into San Jose. If there is a villain in the story of San Jose's rise, or a hero depending on how you look at it, and the two things are not always distinguishable, his name was A.P. Dutch Heyman. He was not an engineer. He was not a visionary. He was a former automobile executive, 50 years old, with no prior political experience, who was appointed city manager of San Jose in 1950 by a split vote of 4-3. He had one idea, and he pursued it with a kind of total commitment that in a different era might have been diagnosed. The idea was that San Jose should be the biggest city in the Bay Area. He said this out loud. He said it frequently. "They say San Jose is going to become another Los Angeles," he told his critics. "Believe me, I'm going to do the best in my power to make that come true." The first thing he did was build a sewage treatment plant with far more capacity than the city of 95,000 people could possibly use. This seems like an odd place to start a campaign of urban dominance, but it was not. A sewage plant was the key that opened every other door, because without sewage service, the unincorporated farmland surrounding San Jose could not be legally developed. And Hammond intended to annex that farmland. All of it. His method was the annexation, executed at a speed and scale that had no precedent in American municipal history. In the 42 annexations that had taken place in San Jose's entire history before Hammond arrived, he oversaw 491 in his first decade alone, and more than 900 in his second. By the time he was done, his staff, known as Dutch's Panzer Division, named after the armored tank squadrons of the Third Reich, had annexed the city's territory 1,377 times, growing San Jose from 17 square miles to 149. His finishing move was the tentacle. He identified where major shopping centers were going to be built. Then, before they were announced, he annexed narrow bands of land along the major roadways leading to those locations, pushing San Jose's city limits across the valley and simultaneously walling off every competing city's ability to expand. The sales tax revenue would flow to San Jose. The adjacent cities would be boxed out. San Jose wasn't building a city. It was building a trap. It was just growth, 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 the city's mayor in the 1940s recalled years later. That was everybody's song. And Dutch sang it the loudest. What Hammond didn't plan for was what all that growth looked like when it arrived. San Jose in the 1950s and 1960s became an almost archetypal example of post-war American suburban sprawl. Vast tracts of single-family housing, strip malls, car-dependent neighborhoods with no centers and no particular character. The walkable downtown that had existed before the automobile was hollowed out as retail followed the middle class to the suburbs Hammond was busily annexing. What was left behind was a vacuum that would take decades to even partially fill. But underneath the blandness, something extraordinary was taking shape. The semiconductor companies clustering around Stanford were running out of room in the northern part of the county. San Jose had room. San Jose had infrastructure. San Jose had a city manager whose answer to every request from a company that wanted to expand was yes, immediately. And what else can I do for you? The companies came. And when the companies came, the workers came with them. San Jose's population, which had been 95,000 in 1950, doubled to 204,000 by 1960 and doubled again to 445,000 by 1970. In 20 years, a town had become a city. The orchards that John Muir had once called the Valley of Heart's Delight began to disappear beneath the foundations of semiconductor fabrication plants and research laboratories and the ranch houses of the engineers who worked in them. Between 1940 and 1973, the acreage devoted to orchards in the Santa Clara Valley fell from 100,000 acres to 25,000. The trees didn't die. They were bulldozed. And what replaced them was worth so much more that almost no one thought to mourn them until it was far too late. If you were a fruit farmer in the Santa Clara Valley in 1960 and you looked out your window at your 20 acres of apricot trees, you were already living in a world that was moving on without you. The land under those trees was worth more than the fruit they would ever produce. The offers from developers were arriving in your mailbox every week, and some of your neighbors had already taken them. And now their orchards were becoming cul-de-sacs, with names like Apricot Lane and Cherry Blossom Drive, which is how cities eulogize the things they've destroyed by naming streets after them. The Cold War arrived in the Santa Clara Valley, and it arrived with money. The military needed electronics, radar, communication systems, guidance systems for missiles. Silicon-based semiconductors were the answer, and the Santa Clara Valley was producing them faster than anywhere else on Earth. Lockheed opened a facility in Sunnyvale in 1956, employing tens of thousands of engineers. The federal government was writing checks, and the checks were cashing out in ranch houses and laboratory expansions all across the valley. The defense money did something else. It made venture capital make sense. If the government was going to spend enormous sums buying whatever the best engineers could create, then backing those engineers before they created it was not a gamble. It was an investment strategy. The Traitorous 8 deal was the first clear statement of a logic that would eventually restructure the entire global economy. Find the best people, give them money before they have a product, and get out of the way. When Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore left Fairchild in 1968 and started Intel, they weren't just starting a company, they were establishing a template. You work somewhere. You learn everything. You leave. You start something. Engineers stopped thinking of themselves as employees. They thought of themselves as founders who hadn't yet found the right moment to leave. In 1971, a journalist named Don Hopfler coined the phrase Silicon Valley in a trade publication, a shorthand for what was happening in the Santa Clara Valley. The name caught immediately. Within a few years, everyone was using it. The Santa Clara Valley had a new identity built entirely around a material, silicon, that was as different from an apricot as anything in nature could possibly be. By the mid-1970s, San Jose was beginning to understand what it had become, and it wasn't sure it was happy about it. The city had grown enormously, almost incomprehensibly, and almost entirely without guidance beyond Hammond's simple imperative to grow. The downtown was a hollow shell. Traffic was getting worse every year. An anti-growth movement had emerged, championed by a new generation of city leaders, including a young politician named Norman Mineta that was trying to impose order on the chaos Hammond had left behind. The anti-growth movement was right about the problems. It was wrong about the solution. The growth boundaries they established, the development fees they imposed, the zoning restrictions they tightened, all of these things slowed the construction of new housing without slowing the arrival of new workers. The mismatch, which began modestly in the 1970s, would grow into one of the great housing crises in American urban history. But that was still decades away, and in the meantime, the valley was about to experience the most intoxicating period of growth any place on Earth had ever seen. If this story means anything to you, if you have ever bought a computer or used the Internet, or carried a smartphone, or watched any of the companies that were born in this valley reshape the world you live in, take a moment, right now, because what I'm about to describe is the thing that made all of it possible, and most people who benefit from it every day have never really understood how close it came to not happening, or how many people got steamrolled in the process of making it happen. And if you want to keep hearing stories like this one, the real stories, not the sanitized version, but the full picture of how the world actually got built, hit subscribe right now. We put out this kind of deep history every week, and there is so much more of this story left to tell. The personal computer arrived in the mid-1970s looking like a toy. But in Menlo Park, a group of engineers calling themselves the Homebrew Computer Club were passing around spec sheets and feeling what only engineers feel when they encounter a nascent technology at the exact moment of its inflection, the intoxicating certainty that this changes everything. Among them were two young men from the valley who had grown up in each other's orbit. Steve Wozniak was the engineer, methodical, precise, almost comically talented at doing more with less circuitry than anyone thought was achievable. Steve Jobs was the other thing, restless, driven, aesthetically gifted, possessed of an absolute conviction that technology should be beautiful and that beautiful things could be sold at whatever price you needed to charge for them. In 1976, in a garage in Los Altos, they built a computer. They called it the Apple I. In 1977, the Apple II followed, the first personal computer that a person who was not an engineer could actually want. It had color graphics. It had a keyboard. It had a case that looked like it had been designed rather than assembled. Apple Computer went public in December 1980. $300 million was raised. 300 employees became instant millionaires. Every engineer in every building from San Jose to Palo Alto felt something shift in their understanding of what was possible. The Valley was not just a place where you made good money building things for the government. It was a place where you could become astronomically rich while changing how human beings related to information itself. The 1980s were a decade of such extraordinary compression that it becomes difficult to describe in linear terms. Cisco Systems was founded in San Jose in 1984 by Stanford computer scientists who had been trying to send messages across the university's network and kept running into the problem that different computer systems couldn't talk to each other. Their solution was the router, a device that learned how to translate between networks, and it would eventually become the physical backbone of the Internet. They named the company after the city they could see from their lab window. Cisco, San Francisco. The kind of quiet tribute that only engineers make. Adobe Systems was founded in 1982 in Mountain View by two former Xerox researchers who had figured out how to describe any document, any photograph, any illustration, any page of type, in a language that any printer could understand. It was perhaps the least glamorous-sounding innovation in the history of technology, and it was also the thing that made desktop publishing possible, which made independent media possible, which made the visual Internet possible. Adobe is headquartered in San Jose today. The Valley was producing companies the way Fairchild had produced engineers, in accelerating numbers, each one feeding the next, each success attracting more capital, more talent, more ambition. The money attracted the talent, and the talent created the companies, and the companies made the money, and the cycle spun faster every year. San Jose, sitting at the southern end of all this activity, was by the 1980s the largest city in the Valley and increasingly the address of choice for companies that needed space and couldn't afford the rents further north. Cisco moved its headquarters there. eBay would eventually follow. PayPal, Western Digital. Broadcom, the city that Dutch Heyman had built with his tentacle annexations and his sewage plant and his absolute indifference to planning, had, in spite of itself, become the capital of the most important industry in the world. In 1990, San Jose's population crossed a threshold that no one who had grown up there in the 1950s would have believed possible. It surpassed San Francisco. The city that had been the regional joke, the flat agricultural town that San Francisco residents flew over without acknowledging, was now larger than its glamorous neighbor to the north. The city that had been smaller than Fresno 40 years earlier was now the 10th largest in the United States and growing. And then came the Internet, and everything that had happened before began to look like practice. The World Wide Web went public in 1991. For most of the country, it was a curiosity. In the Santa Clara Valley, it was immediately understood as what it was, a distribution system for the digital world that these engineers had been building for 40 years, suddenly accessible to everyone on Earth who had a phone line and a computer. The 1990s .com boom was not an accident or a delusion. It was the rational response of an entire ecosystem of entrepreneurs, investors, and engineers who understood that the architecture of human commerce and communication was about to be rebuilt from scratch, and who wanted to be the ones doing the rebuilding. The money came in quantities that had no precedent in the history of private investment. Venture capital funds that had operated in the tens of millions were suddenly deploying hundreds of millions. Companies were going public before they had revenue, sometimes before they had products. The NASDAQ index climbed and climbed and climbed. In 1999 and 2000, at the absolute peak, companies with names that ended in com were worth more than the industrial giants that had built the physical infrastructure of the 20th century. Paper millionaires were everywhere. Every garage in the valley seemed to contain a startup, which meant every garage in the valley contained at least 3 people who were convinced they were going to be billionaires. There is a road in the hills above San Jose, a winding stretch of asphalt running through the Diablo Range. And if you pull over at the right spot on a clear winter evening, before the marine layer comes in off the bay, you can see the entire valley from end to end. The light spread from the Santa Cruz Mountains to the Diablo Range, from the southern bay to the edges of the hills. This carpet of light, this improbable density of human activity, in a valley that 200 years ago contained nobody except a few thousand alone and some Spanish missionaries trying to save their souls. From up there, at that distance, you can almost believe the whole thing was inevitable. That this particular valley, with its particular geography and its proximity to a particular university, was always going to become this. That the intelligence that flowed into it was always going to find its way here, the way water finds the lowest point of a landscape. But it was not inevitable. Nothing about it was inevitable. The traitorous 8 could have stayed at Shockley. Frederick Terman could have let his students go east. Dutch Hallman could have spent his tenure building transit instead of annexations. The anti-growth mayors could have built housing instead of restrictions. At every point in this story, it could have been different. It could have been less. It could have been better. It could have been more humane. The valley that calls itself the most innovative place on earth has never quite figured out how to innovate its way to an equitable society, and that failure is as much a part of its history as any breakthrough that ever happened in any garage. That's the story of San Jose. Not the clean version, not the TED Talk version, not the version they teach in business school, but the full version, the one that starts with 4,000 years of Olón history and runs through mercury poisoning and Spanish colonial agriculture and a valley, of heart's delight and a city manager's obsession with becoming Los Angeles and 8 engineers who quit on the same day and changed the world and 2 young men in a garage and the enormous, complicated, beautiful, brutal, unfinished thing that is the capital of Silicon Valley today. The apricot trees are gone. The chips are everywhere. And the valley is still becoming something none of us can quite see yet. That's been true, more or less, since 1777. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself thinking about those orchards, or those 8 engineers, or the families who got pushed out, or the families who got to stay, please subscribe. Every week we go this deep on a city, a moment, a place where the world turned on its axis and most people missed it. This is history that matters, and it doesn't get told enough. Subscribe now, and you won't miss what's coming next.